Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to read to you a new edited version of a story that I began about 4 or 5 years ago. It's called Hallows House, a ghost story mystery, and I've been revisiting the story over the past couple of months and rewriting bits, editing bits. So I'm going to read the first chapter for you, and then I will try and record more chapters, re-edited versions in the coming months, and new chapters to come very soon too. So let's begin. A curious encounter on All Hallows Eve prompted a series of events that we still don't fully understand. It sent us on a journey into the past, rediscovering people long since dead and events long since forgotten about. Names and places have been changed where necessary to protect the identities of those still living and those who have passed on. This is our story. Chapter 1. The Stranger. Saturday, the 26th of October. It all began a year ago on a chilly morning at the end of October. We sat on the front doorstep of our new home, waiting for Mrs. Locke to arrive with the keys. She was 20 minutes late, and there was no sign of the removals van. I rubbed the palms of my hands together to try to encourage some heat. Next to me, Rachel sighed, shivered, and began knocking the heel of her boot against the stone step. She was bored, and I was irritated. "Go and sit in the car if you're cold," I said, handing her the car keys. She nudged my hand away and shook her head. "No, I'm fine," she said, shifting her scarf so it hid her mouth and nose. I checked my watch. It was just after 10. Surely Mrs. Locke wasn't going to be much longer. Another minute and I'd have to give her a ring. I stood up, motivated by the cold and the need to get away from the racket Rachel was making with her boot. Walking the short distance to the end of the garden path, I leaned over the gate and scanned up and down the empty road. There wasn't a soul in sight. I turned and rested my back against the rickety gate. It creaked in protest. Before me stood our new home. It looked huge and old and empty. I gazed up at the roof. The tops of the 3 chimneys were obscured by a chilly, low-lying sea fret that hung in the air and varnished the slate tiles beneath with icy dew. I thrust my hands into my pockets and shivered. The last time I'd seen the house was in July. That was over 4 months ago. Then it had been warm and sunny, and the house had glowed. The tiny blue and green stained glass panels on the front door had sparkled in the sunshine. Now the colours looked dull and muddy in today's muted October light. My summer memory recalled an attractive nautical design etched into a long glass panel above the door. Now, peering with squinted eyes, I could barely make out the designed jaunty 3-masted clipper ship. Its vibrancy was gone, and the vessel looked adrift and lost in a sea of dirty haze. I scanned the rest of the house and frowned. How had I not noticed in July what was obviously apparent now? How had I missed the peeling paintwork on the bay window frames or the rusting metal drain pipes, one of which hung precariously to the top of the wall by a single nail, or the tangle of unruly grey vines which sprawled across the brickwork like a giant dead spider? I had no memory of that. I remembered a charming old climbing rose with vibrant red petals and glossy green leaves that meandered its way around the house's decorative brickwork. Now all that was gone. The plant was dead, or dormant. I couldn't really tell. Had I made a mistake? I felt my enthusiasm for the house waning. There was so much to do. I could hear my savings account groaning in anticipation of its future losses. Tom had said as much. Not that it was any of his business anymore, but perhaps I should have paid more attention to the 42-page property survey received a month before I signed the final transfer deed. Rachel had retrieved it from the bottom of my bag, scrutinised it, and returned it to me with phrases such as considerable damp and rotting window frames, underlined by her in thick red pen. It hadn't made any difference, though. You see, from the very first viewing, the house had captivated me. I'd fallen in love with the spacious rooms, the high ceilings, beautiful cornicing and original ceiling roses, all still in place and untouched by any modernising hand. Every room had its own decorative fireplace and original hardwood flooring, and the attic space was large and bright and accessed by a spiral staircase. I mean, a spiral staircase. Who wouldn't want one of those? Then there was also the feeling. It's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it, but it was a good feeling, a warm feeling. The house drew me in. I felt at home, comforted, safe. I shook the negative thoughts out of my head. No, I decided, I hadn't made a mistake. It'd be fine once we got inside. I knew what I was doing. I took out the rolled-up sales brochure from the back pocket of my jeans. The front cover showed a photograph of the house, taken at the beginning of spring, when the climbing rose was just about to bud, and the new green shoots were appearing around the soil borders. I guessed that was evidence of other emerging garden perennials, but since I didn't know my delphiniums from my hollyhocks, it was destined to remain a mystery, for now. I scanned the brochure's sales blurb. Number 9 Orchard Road, it began, is a charming mid-Victorian semi-detached house located in the quiet seaside town of Monk's Ferry. This once grand but now tired home is in need of an affectionate new owner. I knew how it felt. I flipped through the rest of the pages. 6 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, large dining kitchen, attic and basement. What on earth was I going to do with all the space? I rolled the sales brochure back up and shoved it under my arm. I glanced over at Rachel. She'd shifted her position and was now kneeling at the side of the step. She seemed to be peering at something and rubbing away at the stone with her hand. I smiled. That was Rachel, forever curious, always investigating. I knew, though, that she wasn't completely happy with the move, and I wasn't sure how long she'd stay. After university, she'd lived with her father for a couple of months, but it hadn't worked out. Tom was away for much of the time, and she'd struggled to find a job. Then, out of the blue, and much to my surprise, she'd taken a part-time position at the local library here in the town. This came with the proviso that the job and living with me was only temporary, at least until something else came along. I think she meant something better, but didn't want to hurt my feelings. I knew the town would prove way too quiet for Rachel, but for me it was perfect. I'd hankered after living close to the sea for as long as I could remember. It was like a childhood dream come true. As soon as I'd seen the cream-coloured Victorian lighthouse perched on a stony outcrop in the bay, I was smitten. After that, my romantic notions were further piqued by a visit to the town's Benedictine priory, now partially ruined, but still steeped in early medieval mystery. I imagined brisk walks on the beach and quiet strolls through the nearby countryside. Rachel said she imagined stomping through cold and mud in the winter and dodging annoying tourists in the summer. You can see why I thought she wouldn't stay. Suddenly, she shouted over to me, "Mum, have you seen this?" "Seen what?" I said. "There's something here," she answered. "It's scratched into the stone. Looks like numbers and letters." She was still staring at the step, and her hair had fallen forwards over her face, muffling her voice. "What does it say?" I asked. "It says H.H. 1873, followed by the letters E and J," she answered, looking up and brushing her hair away from her mouth. "Was that the year the house was built?" 1873? "Yes, that's possible," I said. "I wonder what the letters refer to," she said. I had no idea. I'd been given little background information about the house from the estate agent, and my solicitor had provided scant documentation. "I'll ask Mrs. Locke about it," I said, "when or if she ever gets here." "Don't waste your time," said Rachel sarcastically. I smiled. She had a point. Everything Mrs. Locke said was either vague or made no sense. When I'd inquired about the previous owners of the house, she'd mumble something incoherent, changed the subject, and instead told me where I could buy the best fish in Monk's Ferry. "You'll have to do a little bit of house research for me at the library," I said. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, sure," she said, standing up. Suddenly there was a loud "Yoo-hoo!" accompanied by the sound of jangling keys coming from the other side of the road. I turned to see the voluptuous Mrs. Locke from Grab and Lock estate agents puffing her way towards me, as if from nowhere. "Sorry I'm late," she exclaimed, thrusting a bunch of keys at me. "Our Saturday girl Debbie misplaced them. The keys, I mean. Oh, and look, your van has arrived. I would say that's perfect timing. Wouldn't you?" she added, as a large removals lorry came into view and slowly began to back its way down the road. Rachel joined me at the gate and whispered in my ear, "About time. I thought I was going to freeze to death." I smiled, put my arm around my daughter, and gave her a little squeeze. For now, the strange inscription on the doorstep was forgotten, as everybody got busy, and we finally moved ourselves and our belongings into 9 Orchard Road. Wednesday, the 31st of October. It was 5 days later. The nights were drawing in at this time of year, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon it was already quite dark. Rachel was upstairs in her bedroom. I sat downstairs in the living room, watching the television with a cup of tea perched precariously on my knee, since our coffee table was hidden under a pile of curtains, waiting to be hung. Despite much activity over the past days, every room in the house was still littered with boxes and discarded packing paper. On the telly, the BBC was showing a rerun of the Great British Baking Show, and someone in a messy apron was dripping icing over a delicious-looking Victoria sponge with a strawberry jam centre. It was making me peckish, so I decided to go and see if we had anything cake-like in the kitchen cupboards. As I got up from the sofa, I was startled by a sudden loud chiming sound which appeared to be coming from the hallway. I went to investigate, and as I did, Rachel came to the top of the staircase. "What's that awful racket?" she shouted down. "I think it's coming from the grandfather clock under the stairs," I replied. "It's loud, isn't it?" "Seriously, Mum," she said. "That's horrendous. Is it going to keep doing that?" "I don't know," I said. "I didn't even know it worked." "I bet Mrs. Locker's been fiddling with it," she muttered, adding, "Mum, it's ugly and old. It's probably got woodworm. No idea why you decided to keep it." At this point, neither did I. The previous occupants of the house had left it behind, and I'd assumed it didn't work. At least it hadn't shown any sign of life since we'd moved in. Perhaps the local antique shop would be interested in it. As the ringing sound abated, I made a mental note to pop into the shop and ask next time I was in town. I grabbed my unfinished tea from the living room, abandoned my search for cake, and made my way up the creaky staircase to join my daughter. Rachel had chosen the largest of the 3 rooms at the back of the house. She said she liked it because on one side it had a bay window and seating area with a view overlooking our small, but perfectly formed, in my opinion, kitchen garden. A high stone wall divided our garden from the grounds of a neglected manor house beyond, and to the left of that, through dense trees and bushes, you could just make out the ancient spire of All Hallows Church. As I entered her room, I saw that she was sitting in the window seat with her back to me, staring out into the darkness. There were little tinny-sounding voices coming from an ancient transistor radio on the floor. The voices appeared to be having an argument. "What are you listening to?" I asked. "It's the local station," she answered, without looking around. "MFFM. It's a phone-in. Someone's complaining about dog waste on the seafront." "MFFM?" I asked, mystified. "Monk's Ferry FM, Mum. It's not difficult." "Oh, right, of course," I said, feeling a little foolish. I picked up the transistor from the floor. "You know, you've just told me off for having an ancient clock in the hallway. But this thing is falling apart." "It's vintage, Mum," she said. "There's a difference." "I don't see any difference," I said, joining her at the window seat. She turned to face me, took the radio and turned it off. "This is an original 1960s Bosch TR82C in off-white, Mum," she said. "It's collectible." "I'm an original from the 1960s too. Does that make me vintage and collectible?" I said. She grinned. "No, that just makes you old," she said. "Cheek," I exclaimed. "Anyway," she said, turning her attention back to the window, "did you know it's Halloween tonight? I wonder if the kids around here go in for trick-or-treat." "No, I didn't realise," I said. "We've been so busy I hadn't noticed the date. We haven't got anything to give them, even if they do come knocking. No sweets, not even any cake." "Have you been watching the baking show?" she said. "I thought I heard the theme tune just before." "Yes, and now I'm starving," I said, standing up. I walked over to her bed and began folding up some clean towels that lay on it in an untidy heap. "We'll just have to turn off the lights and pretend we're not in, if any trick-or-treaters call." "It's what Aunt Frances would do," she said. "Don't get me started on what Aunt Frances would do," I said. She'd have them all hauled off to the local police station. Anyway, the house has been unoccupied for a while, so perhaps the locals won't bother us. Yeah, maybe, she said distractedly. She turned her attention back to the window. I finished folding the towels and began to sort out a pile of socks. You know, there's always an odd sock left over after a wash. It's strange that, isn't it? She didn't answer. I wonder where they go, I continued. Still no reply. Rach, did you hear me? I said, glancing over to her. I put the socks down and walked back to the window seat. She seemed mesmerised by the view outside. Anything interesting out there in the gloom? I said, tapping her on the shoulder. She flinched at my touch and turned to me in surprise. Did you say something? I've been saying quite a lot of things, I said. You said something about socks? I did, but now it sounds a bit daft. She turned back to the window. There's a light, she said slowly. Out there. It flickers. I followed her gaze through the glass. There was nothing there. All I could see was the darkness outside and my own ghostly image reflected back at me. I can't see anything, I said. It's probably nothing, Rach. Look, I'm going to put those towels in the airing cupboard. Are you coming down soon? I'll make some hot chocolate. Yeah, she answered distantly. Soon. Later that evening, I'd relocated downstairs to the front room. Rachel had eventually joined me and now sat on the opposite end of the sofa, curled up with her phone, engrossed in a text conversation with friends. After a lot of faff and a futile search for my stepladders, I'd managed to hang the curtains in the bay window with the help of one of my rickety old chairs. They were now tightly drawn and all the lights turned off. The sound was down low on the television, and the latest episode of the Antiques Auction flickered quietly away in the background. A woman in a brightly coloured blouse was getting very excited about an extremely ugly orange and purple teapot. It looked worthless to me, but what did I know? I was attempting, without much success, to tackle a piece of knitting I'd found at the bottom of a packing box. It wasn't going well, and I was getting a little fed up with it. Thankfully, we hadn't had any Halloween callers up to that point, although we had heard several footsteps and chattering children's voices outside. Maybe they had been bothering our neighbours instead of us. Another hour went by. It was now just after 8:30, and it had started to rain quite heavily. I can't see anyone calling now, can you? I said to Rachel. She lifted her head from her phone. No, not now, she said, stretching out her arms and yawning. It should be safe to put the lights back on. She reached over and flicked the switch on the nearest lamp. I can't believe we did this. Feels a bit mean. It worked, though, I said, throwing my unruly knitting on the floor. This is going in the bin. How long have you been making that? She asked, looking at the unshapely woolen mess. It was a cardigan for your 12th birthday. Seriously? She laughed. Woolen crafts are not my forte, I said. Apparently not, she said, picking up and investigating the tangled heap of wool and needles. You should take up another hobby. It was never really a hobby, I said. More like a challenge that I was never able to fulfill. She smiled and placed her empty hot chocolate mug on the floor next to her. How about baking? She said. Didn't you used to bake? I was just about to answer, when there were 2 loud raps on the front door. I flinched and looked at Rachel in panic. "Oh no, spoke too soon," she said, reaching over to turn off the lamp. "That's not going to do any good now, Rach," I scolded. "It's too late. We've been found out." I got up off the sofa and made my way into the hallway. "Just ignore it," she called after me. "Remember, we haven't got anything to give them. No sweeties, no cake." "Then I'll have to firmly but politely send them away," I answered back. "I'm afraid we don't have anything for you," I said, as I opened the door to the anticipated assembly of small witches, wizards and ghouls. But there were no little trick-or-treaters in fancy costumes on my doorstep. Instead, a tall, dark stranger stood before me. "Oh," I gasped in surprise. The stranger cleared his throat and held out a gloved hand. Without thinking, I reached out and took it. The hand felt deathly cold and thin underneath a damp kid glove. It made me feel strangely uneasy. He was dressed in a formal, dark, knee-length overcoat. On his head sat a top hat, which glistened with speckled raindrops. The brim of the hat cast a partial shadow across his face, disguising his eyes, but I could just about make out a thin moustache above his lip, and small, round metal glasses perched low on the bridge of a bony nose. Oddly, his older-fashioned dress didn't seem out of place on this cold Halloween evening. "Can I help you?" I said, as I withdrew my hand from his. I heard Rachel come into the hallway and stand behind me. The stranger cleared his throat again and made a slow bow. "Good evening," he said, in a low, rasping voice. There was a hint of an accent, but I couldn't quite place it. "The Messrs. Pike send their regards," he continued. "They believe you are the new occupants of the house and have instructed me to pass on to you this package." Rachel peeped over my shoulder to get a better look. The stranger paused and, noticing Rachel for the first time, exclaimed, "Miss Pike, I had no idea. Please forgive me." He took a step back and lowered his gaze. Rachel shifted behind me uncomfortably. I was confused. "No, you're mistaken," I said. "This is my daughter Rachel. We don't know anybody by the name of Pike. I think you have the wrong house." He looked up at Rachel and shook his head. "I could have sworn," he said in bewilderment. "You are the image of my mistress. A trick of the light, perhaps, Miss—" Rachel moved to my side. "My name is Rachel," she said curtly. "My mum just told you that. More to the point, who are you and what do you want? It's cold with the door open and we're getting wet." He began to cough, a deep, chesty, hacking cough. He reached inside his overcoat and brought out a white handkerchief, which he held in front of his mouth until the cough subsided. Then, taking a couple of slow, deep breaths, he continued, "My name? My name is of no importance. I only wish to pass on my employer's regards and this small package. The Messrs. Pike beg your assistance. All you need is inside." He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick brown paper envelope tied together with old string. He handed it to me. I hesitated and then took it from him. He bowed deeply, doffed his hat and said quietly, "I wish you both success in your quest. Good night and good luck." Then, turning slowly, he began walking away down the garden path. I shouted after him, "I'm sorry, What do you mean? Our quest? What quest? We don't understand. Turning back towards us, he smiled briefly, raised his hand in farewell, and then disappeared into the rain and the darkness. As I closed the door, Rachel took the stranger's envelope from me and turned it over in her hands. What was all that about? I shook my head. Well, he's obviously got the wrong house, I said. Probably best not to open that. He'll come back for it once he realises the mistake he's made. What did he call me? Miss Pike, she said. Yes, that's what he said, I answered. It's probably meant for next door. Maybe their name is Pike. Rachel nodded and casually tossed the envelope onto the hallway table. You're right, she said, turning to me with a smile. At least he didn't ask for any treats. Thursday, the 1st of November. The evening passed without further event, and the following morning I had almost forgotten about our strange Halloween encounter when Rachel came down in her dressing gown, looking tired and dishevelled. Morning, she said dully. Any tea in the pot? Yes, it's a fresh brew, I answered, handing her a clean mug. She flopped down at the breakfast table and combed her fingers through her tangled hair. I had the oddest dream last night, Mum. I think it had something to do with that weird Victorian man. Weird Victorian man? I laughed. You saw how he was dressed, she said, holding out her mug. He did look strange, I said, pouring her some tea. Perhaps he'd been to a Halloween party or something. You know, fancy dress. Out at a party with a cough like that, she said, cupping her hands around the mug and taking a sip. He sounded like he didn't have long for this world. I smiled and nodded. True. Anyway, your dream. What was it about? I dreamt that I was in the old manor house at the back of our garden. But it wasn't me, she said. I was someone else. I wasn't in my own body. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. Most dreams don't make any sense, Rach, I said. Yeah, but I think this dream had something to do with the light I kept seeing out of my bedroom window yesterday. I didn't think anything of it at first, she said. It started as soon as it got dark. It seemed to be coming from one of the top floor windows of the manor house. Then after a while I thought I saw somebody in the window, looking out. I'm not sure that's even possible, Rach. It's empty. It doesn't look habitable, I said. Yeah, I know. Maybe I'm seeing things, she said, staring at her mug. We've had a busy few weeks, Rach. A lot's happened. I'm not surprised you're feeling a bit unsettled. Why don't you have some breakfast? I'm making porridge. Ooh, she answered, pulling a face. I'll take that as a no then, I said, moving to the fridge and taking out a carton of milk. She stood up and made her way to the hallway. I'm going to open the stranger's package, she said. Hold on, I said. I thought we agreed last night that it probably wasn't for us. Well, Christopher Lee hasn't come back for it, so it must be for us. Rachel, don't call him that, I scolded. It's early. He might come back later. She ignored me and returned with the envelope, unknotted the string around it, tore a strip off the top, and reached inside to remove the contents. You shouldn't have done that, Rachel, I said. What if the parcel's for next door? Isn't it illegal to open someone else's mail? She screwed her face up at me. Then I'll stick it back together again before they notice, she said, reaching inside and pulling out a bundle of old papers and a large brass object. Oh, look at this, she exclaimed. There's a key. Then discarding the envelope and the rest of its contents on the breakfast table, She knelt next to the fireplace and used the light of the fire to examine the key more closely. "There's some writing on it," she said. "The number 3 and an inscription. It says HH 1873 E and J." "That sounds familiar," I said, as I added milk and porridge to my saucepan and began to stir. "Yeah, isn't it the same inscription I found at the side of the front doorstep on the day we moved in?" she said. "Ah, yes, I'd completely forgotten about that." "Me too," she said, passing me the key. I left my porridge to simmer on the hob and popped on my reading glasses. The key was about 4 inches long, old and heavy. "You know, you've missed something," I said, squinting at the words. "After the E and J, it also says the word Pike." "Messrs. Pike, the name Mr. Creepy mentioned," Rachel exclaimed. "Rach, that's unnecessary," I scolded again. "The poor man didn't sound very well." She rolled her eyes at me and took back the key. Slowly she turned it over in her hands. "E and J Pike," she mused. "I wonder who they were." "Perhaps they lived here at one time," I offered. She nodded. "Yeah, otherwise, why else would they engrave their names onto our front doorstep?" "Maybe they were the builders? That's also a possibility," I said. "Well, whoever they were, there's obviously a connection between these Pikes and the ones who left us the envelope," said Rachel. Then, looking at me with a smile, she added, "Wouldn't it be great if we could find out where the key fits? Perhaps there's a secret door somewhere." "I doubt it," I said. "All the doors and keys are accounted for in this house." "Yes, but none of those are secret," she said. "I think you're missing the point about what a secret door is." She picked up her mug and began rifling through the rest of the contents of the envelope. "Maybe that's the quest the stranger mentioned," she continued, "to find out what is hiding behind the secret door." "I think your imagination is running away with you," I said, taking my porridge off the stove and pouring the hot gloop into a bowl. "Look, I'm still going to have a chat with next door, see if they know anything about this. Do me a favour, don't do anything with the envelope until I've spoken to them. I'm still not completely convinced that this is all for us." "Yeah, sure," she said distractedly. "Anyway, looks like the rest of this stuff is just newspaper clippings and old documents." She stuffed the pile of papers back into the envelope and stood up. "I have to go and get ready for work." "Will you be in late?" I asked. "We close at 6, she said, "and I have to pop to the pub afterwards." "Have to?" I smiled. She smiled back. "It's someone's birthday. You know how it is. I'm only staying for one, though." "What are you doing for tea?" "Fish pie," I said. "Thought I'd take up Mrs. Locke's fish shop recommendation." "Well, she's come in handy for something then," she said, raising her eyebrows and heading back into the hallway. I spent much of the rest of the day out in the town. As well as registering for the local doctor's surgery and popping into the bank to pay some bills, I'd also located Mrs. Locke's fish shop. It was called rather grandly the Seafood Emporium, and stood on the corner of Back Lane, next to the seafront. On the sign outside was a picture of a jolly, ruddy-faced fisherman in a blue woolen gansey. He was holding a large, recently caught fish in one hand and looking very pleased with himself. I also found the antique shop, Bob's Attic, spelled unnecessarily, I thought, with a K instead of a C. It was on Grape Street in the town centre, but it was closed. I didn't know who Bob, with 2 B's, was, but I'd hoped to go in and find out if they were interested in our noisy old clock. I'd have to leave that to another day. It was just after 4:30 when I got home. I prepared the fish pie and then decided to dedicate what was left of the late afternoon by sorting out piles of Rachel's clothes she said she didn't want any more. Much of it would probably go to the local charity shop. I also decided that my collection of 2 pairs of knitting needles and 5 balls of wool, hardly a collection I know, might as well go there too. As Rachel had said, I needed another hobby. Sometime later, I heard the front door open. "Only me," shouted Rachel from the bottom of the stairs. "Mum, are you up there?" "Yes," I shouted back. "I'm in my bedroom." "You're early." A moment later, she appeared at the door. "What do you mean early? It's 7 o'clock, she said. "Seriously?" I said. "I thought it was only 6. She sat on the edge of the bed and thrust the stranger's envelope towards me. "All of this stuff," she said eagerly, "relates to our house and the people that built it and lived here. I was right. This package was meant for us." "You took this to work?" I said, taking it from her. "Yeah," she answered. "I told you I was going to." "I don't remember that. I asked you to wait until I'd spoken to the people next door." "And did you?" she said. "No, I haven't had chance," I answered. "I've been busy sorting out your stuff." She paused and took the envelope back. "Then you don't want to know what's in it?" she said curtly. I folded my arms in irritation. "No, of course I'm interested, but it was a simple request, Rach. I asked you to wait." "I'm sorry," she snapped, standing up and heading towards the bedroom door. "What difference does it make? I'd already opened it." I paused for a moment. She was right. It didn't make a difference. But why hadn't she listened to me? "Okay, look, forget it," I said. "Let's start again. Tell me what you found." She bit her lip and sat back down again. "Did you find out about the key?" I asked. "No, still working on that," she said. "But the key must have something to do with our house, or next door's." "Okay, stop. Now I'm confused," I said. "Then the parcel is for the neighbours?" "Yes," she said slowly, "kind of. Both our house and next door's used to be connected. It was one large residence, and it had a name." "Fascinating," I said. "What was it called?" "Let's go downstairs and I'll show you," she said. "There's loads to tell." While Rachel spread the old papers from the envelope out onto the kitchen table, I began serving up the fish pie. She picked up her fork, took a bite of buttery mashed potato, and then with her free hand passed some of the musty pages to me. "Here's a document which talks about the land that our house is built on. It also mentions the names of the people who originally owned it." "Interesting," I said, running my fingers across the handwritten script. "This doesn't feel like paper. It's got a different texture." "Sue in Archives says it's made of vellum," said Rachel. "Can you read it? It's a bit difficult." "I'll have a go," I said, tracing my index finger along the first line of faded cursive writing. "I think it says something about the sale of a house called the Old Hall and its land here at Monk's Ferry. The owner and seller of the property is called de Alderville, Radford de Alderville, Esquire. What a name. And the purchaser is Mr. Alpheus Pike, shipbuilder." "Ah, the Pikes." "Exactly," Rachel said. "Keep reading." "Okay. The old hall was sold to this man, Alpheus Pike, in 1850, and..." Before I could continue, Rachel waggled another piece of paper under my nose. "Now read this," she said impatiently. "This document shows that the old hall is the empty manor house at the back of our garden. the one next to the church. Remember I told you that I saw a light coming from there last night? Well, it looks like the Pike family lived there from 1850, and then they, or more specifically the Pike sons, Ebenezer and Joseph, built our house in the Hallows orchard sometime later. Ah, right, so they are the E and J Pike from the inscription on our doorstep, I said. Yes, and on the key, said Rachel. And do you see the name they gave to the new house they built? Our house? I scanned a little further down the page. Hallows House, I exclaimed. What a wonderful name. It is, isn't it? Said Rachel. It must relate to the name of the church, All Hallows. Of course, I said. I imagine this Pike family owned all of the land around here at one time. The church, manor house, everything. Rachel nodded in agreement. I put the papers down on the table and took up my fork for another mouthful of pie. This is fascinating stuff, Rach, I said, but the stranger said the Pike family needed our assistance. I think that's the word he used. But assistance with what? And why did they ask us? I don't know yet, said Rachel, but there's more, Mum. And it does get a little gruesome. I wanted to give you the tame stuff before I showed you the rest. Gruesome, I said, returning my loaded fork to the plate. Now you're worrying me. Well, said Rachel, picking up one of the old newspaper clippings, let me tell you about the murder. And that ends chapter 1 of Hallows House. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.